Joan Buchanan, the Assembly member for the 15th District, has been a successful businesswoman. She was a corporate executive before the age of 30. She left the private sector to raise 5 children. She's a very ambitious person indeed. She's a community activist. She's been a soccer coach, and as a soccer dad myself and former soccer coach, I understand what that entails. She's been a PTA president. She's been almost 20 years on the San Ramon School Board. She has been the vice president of the San Ramon Valley School-Age Child Care Alliance, California Teachers Association State Gold Award, and Alamo Rotary Club Citizen of the Year. And as you can see in the bio, she is a very important chair here in the Assembly. She chairs the Budget Subcommittee on Information Technology and Transportation. She's on quite a number of other chairs, but I just want to underscore one: the Special Education Commission and the Early Learning Quality Improvement System Advisory Committee. So without further ado, Joan Buchanan.
Let me just tell you what an honor and a privilege it is to be here today with all of you. If you couldn't tell by my bio, education and children are my passion. They've been my passion my whole life, and I don't think there's anything we do that's more important than educating our children and preparing them to be the workers and leaders of future generations. So I just want to start out by thanking all of you to choose to be educators, because there's no job in this nation that's more important than the job you do. So let me talk for a minute about civic education, because that's also what all of you do. And I want to start out by telling a story, or share a story of a good friend of mine, Larry Tramatola. Some of you may have crossed his path because he consults oftentimes on school bonds or parcel taxes. But he went over to South Africa to help set up the first free elections. And all of you, I'm sure, know the long history of the vote in South Africa. You had Nelson Mandela, who spent 30 years in jail fighting for his people to have the right to vote. You had professional athletes who refused to compete on South African soil because of apartheid. You had nations and states that stopped doing business with firms that did business in South Africa, all working to unify the country and give everyone a voice and give everyone a vote. So the day came for the elections. Now, because of apartheid, many of the black citizens couldn't read, and they had to print the ballot in color with people's pictures on it so they'd know who they were voting for. And there were very long lines of people waiting to vote. And Larry went up to one man who was in his 90s. And he had been standing in the hot sun for over 10 hours. And he turned to Larry and he said, "I don't know how much longer I'm going to live, but I know I'm going to live long enough to cast my first vote." So when I think of civic education in the United States and think of our voter participation rates, it's something that we take for granted, but people in other countries literally lay down their lives just to have that privilege to cast the ballot. And it's so critically important that people cast informed votes. How many of you read the recent article in the last couple of days about the exit polling, the public policy, PPIC exit polling that they did on the November 2nd election? Did you read that on one of the propositions that failed, people voted no, but they didn't know, they couldn't tell you why they voted no? Now, it could be that the ballot description was a little confusing, which it was, and we know when people are confused, they tend to vote no. But we rely on an informed citizenry to make informed decisions, because that's how we maintain our democracy. That's how we elect people to represent you. That's ultimately how we make the decisions about our local communities, our schools, our state, and our nation. So I think the job you do today is critically important. We want to get to the point where in 2008 we had, in the 15th Assembly District, we had 82% turnout. And this election we had 62. We want to get to the point where we have 80+% turnout in elections because we want people to be informed citizens. We want them to cast votes based on knowledge, and we want them to participate in our democracy because that's the way we're going to make this country and this state great again. So when my good friend Cheryl Cook-Callio, who some of you know, teacher, very involved with We the People, asked me to carry this resolution, I was incredibly honored because I'll be honest with you, you could have asked any of the 80 Assembly members and they would have been very happy to carry this resolution for you. It went through both houses unanimously. So for me, it was a great honor to be chosen, and it's wonderful for me to honor all of the work that you do. So what this resolution does is it names the first Friday of December, which is today, as a Civics Day for teachers. So it's our way as a legislature of acknowledging all the work that you do and saying thank you. Thank you for the work and the time and the energy that you give to your jobs. Thank you for all that you give and do for our students and helping them to grow up to be, again, the future workers and leaders. And it's with great honor and gratitude that I present this certificate to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Will that stay up there?
And I'm leaving the box for you because when you transport it home, you may.
Oh, okay.
Sincerest thanks to Ms. Buchanan for taking time out of her day to come in and start us off with some inspiring words. Thank you. Okay. Next, we are going to start with our first plenary session, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you an absolutely phenomenal individual who is, I think, will really start the day off with a bang. You have his, and I won't read the whole thing, but you have the biographies in your packet. And just to give a short introduction, Professor Gerson is a professor of political science at San Jose State University, where he examines public policy processes at national and state levels. His Public Policy Making in the Democratic Society, A Guide to Civic Engagement, was heralded as a breakthrough in explaining hands-on citizen participation. And when you want an expert on citizen participation, this is the man to go to. We feel very fortunate at the center. He serves as a scholar and a mentor at a number of our programs. So without further ado, Professor Gerson.
Well, it's great to be here. I've been in this room many times. Always on the other side there. I feel a little overwhelmed being here, especially under that portrait. Anybody know who this man is? Yes, Jess Unruh. Jess Unruh, who really, like the picture, was bigger than life. If you know anything about Jess Unruh, he's considered to be, I can't help it, every time I come in this building I have to tell somebody something about it. He's considered to be the father of the modern speakership in the modern legislature in California. And when he became speaker and the legislature became a full-time legislature in the mid-'60s, it was Unruh who really came up with all the new rules and all the new ways of moving this state, really, into the 20th century, legislatively speaking, of about 65 years too late. And we're still catching up. And I also had, one more thing, when I did my PhD dissertation, he was one of the people I interviewed. It took me 2 years to get that interview, but I did it, finally. And I could tell you more stories, but not before a general audience and not with the camera on. But sometime we can chat. Quite a guy and quite a room. I take my students here every spring for the day, and we meet with legislators like Assemblywoman Buchanan and others. And I have to tell you, there's no building that I feel better in than this one, because it is the people's building. And it's always something that's illustrative and informative to even somebody like me. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. I'm delighted to be with you. This is my passion. This is what I live for. This is what I do. I never get tired of talking to anybody about it, even strangers on the train or whatever. Just, come on, we can work this out. What I want to talk to you about today is the whole idea of engagement. And I called this little chat, Otherwise Engaged, the Price We Pay. And really what I want to do is tell you, weave together a little story about educating citizens about our decaying society, and the lack of linkage and as to why all this is happening. It's a little scary, but being the person in my house who always wears the rose-colored glasses, I'm convinced that we'll find our way out if we put our minds to it. Let's begin by just pointing out a couple of facts that are a little discouraging. America is at a crossroads. It's at a crossroads when it comes to citizen engagement. Now, engagement means a lot of things to a lot of people. It means just associated with our neighbors, setting aside some time to chat. It means participating in elections and other political activities. Voting alone is not enough, especially when you don't know what you're doing or why you're doing it. It's knowing what you're voting about. It's knowing all the issues associated with it. It means interest and awareness in all that goes on around us, from global warming to stumbling economy to homelessness to everything in between. But why should we care? Why should it matter? Because the more we care, the more we are aware of our place in the world, both individually and collectively, the more we can guide our own future. The fact is that citizenship does not just grow naturally, like the size of a body during childhood or sometimes in adulthood. Or a swelling shade tree over time. Citizenship can't be left to chance. For under those kinds of circumstances, societies face decay and perhaps even implosion when we take all these things for granted. So then, what are the precious values of citizenship, cultivated and nurtured? Where are they? How do we get there? Where do we go to find it? How can we assure that it's done if it's so important? Well, that takes us to you and me and the things we do, particularly in that precious venue, the classroom. This room, that we walk in and out of every day, this room that we often, forget where everything is because everything just sort of blends in. You put your stuff down on the desk, you look around, let's get to work. This room is so much more than four walls and a roof. It serves so many purposes, and among them, the citizenship builder environment it is, of the first and last resort. Now, we think of the classroom, and we think of some of the things that we do all day long. It's a place where we transmit knowledge. We're knocking things into their heads. We're helping people understand things. Do you get it now? It's a place where hopefully we develop some critical thinking capabilities. Get people to think not just what 2 and 2 is, but why do we even care about 2 and 2? What's the importance of math anyway? We try to help them learn to exchange. And yes, it's a venue for socialization. But beyond all those things that we do every day, teach them things, get them to learn things, get them to spit it back, get them to think it through, all that stuff, the classroom is also the spawning grounds for the nurturing and the advancement of citizenship. Now, citizenship, has lots of characteristics. One of the things we knock into their little heads at various points in the education process is we need to understand our rights. We need to understand our responsibilities. Okay. It also means that we learn to negotiate. We learn to compromise. We learn to find ways to get along and be members of what some of us call the civil society. The idea, we don't take these things for granted. We have to learn these things. Citizenship also teaches us how to build support for widely accepted values. You know some of these. Your students do too. The concepts of majority rule, minority rights, all these types of things. And I dare say, if carried out well, the development of citizenship promotes engagement in the political process. But is it being done right? Is it being done at all? Well, in 21st century America, the classroom has more responsibilities than ever before. I'm telling you this, okay? Few ever perceived that the citizenship building task would fall so disproportionately. We all know we have this task, but fall so disproportionately on the shoulders of educators. And that's because 21st century America is a much different place than even 50 years ago, much less 100 years ago or over 200 years ago when this nation was founded. We now see commonly two working parent families, and that, while it's very good, absolutely critically important, particularly for women to be part of the working world, although they're not quite there yet in terms of income. We know that only about 78%, 78 cents on the dollar. We're working on it. Still, the fact that we have two working parent families today, that increases the difficulty of finding time for just good old-fashioned discussion around that dinner table in the afternoon. What did you do today? You know, what was your day like? What did you come across? What happened? What's been going on in your life? We don't have time for those types of things like we used to. We see latchkey kids these days. You know all about them. And although we have after-school programs, first of all, there aren't that many anymore, right? Budget crunch affects us all. And they hardly substitute for a talk around the dinner table. We see high dropout rates, upwards of 30%. When you talk about those folks who start the 9th grade, by the time we graduate, the 12th grade kids, almost 30% are gone. These folks don't become CEOs, okay? In fact, they're more likely than not to take the lowest rung jobs if they're working at all, or even worse perhaps, engage in crime. So, you know, the whole idea of the time when family units would talk and socialize and nurture one another as members, that stuff doesn't happen like it used to. Along with that, the whole concept of citizenship building as part of that nurturing experience doesn't happen as it used to, where you would talk to your neighbors, where you would talk to other folks, where you would play with other kids. That doesn't happen. All these things are ways in which we develop those citizenship bonds, and they don't happen like they used to. Meanwhile, back at the classroom, they are larger than ever. I'm not talking about the physical building. I'm talking about the number of kids in the classroom, more than ever per teacher. And of course, California has the distinction of being the largest student per teacher education environment in of the 50 states, another first. We're also a room without the necessary tools and supplies, and we're a room, this classroom, that is based increasingly on quantitative assessments rather than critical thinking, which takes time. Don't have time for that. Or intellectual exchange, just the whole idea of bantering back and forth, having 15, 20 minutes to do this. No, 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 we've got to move along, okay? All this places tremendous burdens on the educator. So as a consequence of almost impossible classroom conditions, students exit without these critical tools. Without the tools of life, including the tool of citizenship. And with this emptiness comes a larger price. The first steps of adult disconnectedness and alienation. And maybe some of you have read Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, other wonderful books along this line, studies that show if you don't get it when you're young, you're not going to have it when you're older. That's all there is to it. You never catch up with some of these things. A little data. And I don't want to overdo this data thing, but I just want to give you a little data to show you that I'm not completely nuts. A recent study by the National Conference of Citizenship found that the percentage of Americans who follow public affairs. Do you know what's going on out there? Okay. Do you know what's going on with people unemployed? Do you know what's going on with the deficit? Do you know what's going on with the budget crisis in Sacramento? All these types of things, okay? The percentage of Americans who follow public affairs declined from 40%, not exactly a high point to begin with, right? 40% in 1975 to 28% in 2005. Wow, that's a pretty rapid decline in a pretty short period of time. And that problem, by the way, the study found, is most prevalent among young adults. Between 2002 and 2006, the percentage of people 15 to 25, this is when we have to have them. The percentage of people 15 to 25 interested in current events and political issues declined from 51%, again, not exactly a high point, to 37%. And perhaps one of these things that troubles me particularly greatly was a national survey taken in 2000, wherein 89%, that's like 9 out of 10, pretty close, I do my math, 89% of respondents agreed with the statement. Listen to the statement they agreed with. It would be better if elected officials would just stop talking and take action. You know what? Sometimes gridlock has its place. Sometimes gridlock has its place. If nothing else, it allows the exchange of different ideas. Now, you'd like to overcome it at some point, but the idea of people just taking action without talking, without processing, without considering what's going on all around them, the pros, the cons, the what-ifs, the wherefores, that's a little scary. That's just a little scary, okay? Meanwhile, a national study shows that 75% of all 12th grade students are not proficient in civics, and that only 20% understand the foundations of the American political system. Well, if they're leaving school with only 20% understanding the foundations of the political system, with 75% not proficient in civics, should we be surprised at low voting turnout? Should we be surprised at confusion about ballot initiatives? Should we be surprised that people want simple answers to complicated questions? Not at all. Not at all. What's going on here? Well, more and more generations of Americans don't understand their place in American society, as well as how they may affect it. Many are what has been described as the generation of .nets. .nets are those folks born in the dawn of the Internet age and after the Generation X crowd, for those of you keeping score. And that's from about 1976 on. And here's what we've given the .nets. Well, they've been raised by baby boomer parents who have exceeded the material successes of their own parents, what Tom Brokaw labeled the greatest generation, folks who really weren't material like the next generation, ours. And the boomer parents have asked little of their children, whether in terms of service to the home or to the nation. Well, what do we conclude? What do we conclude about a generation that has done very well materially, many of us, not all of us, but many of us, and have really not passed on to our children things beyond materialism, things about engagement, notions of that nature. What do we conclude? Well, we have given the next generation little reason to become involved. That's what we've done this, okay? I'm sorry, we've done this. We've given them little reason to become involved, and plenty of reasons, by the way, to stay on the sidelines of political life and civic activity. No wonder why Americans are increasingly otherwise engaged. So, what do we do about all this? Okay, it's time to take some medicine. And this is where I think we can really make this a better place, if we're willing to do what has to be done. First, we must invest in ourselves. We need to become more active in the discussion and in the management of critical issues. Not after they have happened, not after things have been done, but before things have been done, before these things are solved. We need to be part of the process. We need to, along those lines, assume responsibility for making our communities better through volunteer activities. This idea of letting somebody else do it just doesn't wash. Because the more we let somebody else do it, the fewer of us are doing it, and the more of us are affected by the few who do. And that isn't right. It isn't right for a society to depend on so few for so many to succeed. It won't work. And to that, along the lines of investment, let me make another suggestion, considered radical perhaps by some. We need to require every citizen at the age of 18 to participate in some form of national service. I said require. I said mandate. What? And there's a land of freedom? Mandates? Yes. Because along with rights in our society come obligations. We're real good on the rights part. We're real short on the obligations part. Okay? There are dozens of countries around the world that require all of their citizens to take part in making their nation better. And by that, I would say 18 months, 2 years perhaps. It could be military service. It could be hospital aid. It could be teacher's aid. It could be police or fire assistance. It could be a forest ranger. There are so many different tasks that we could have our young people do where they learn that they are part of the solution, where they learn that they are part of making our society a better place. And let these folks be paid minimum wage with some sort of stipend set aside for college or additional job training, whatever, okay? Why? Because citizenship in democracy demands that we all play a part in assuring that our democracy thrives. Second, we need to invest in our infrastructure. Oh my. We need to tax, we need to spend. We've got to do both. The money just doesn't come from trees, although we've done a pretty good job of that lately with our economy. The fact of the matter is we've got to tax and spend more on public education. This is an investment we know. We know this investment pays off again and again and again. And that investment takes place in a lot of ways. We've got to begin by spending more time in school. That means a longer school day. That means a longer school year. When's the last time any of your students said, I got to leave in June because I'm going to go pick the crops? This is not the way it is anymore. This is, this is like 200 years ago. Our students don't go pick the crops. Okay, they do lots of other things, but they don't do that. Do you know how many other countries have longer school days, have longer school years? Many of the most successful countries today, the ones passing us by, in some cases as many as 30 more school days a year. And what have we done in California? We're really leading the way. Okay, it was not so long ago 190 days, then 185, then 180, and now this year the minimum is 175, unless you're in a few grandfather districts where the minimum is 170. Yes, sir, we're going in the right direction. No, we need to go in the other direction. That means more time in school. That means more longer school days. And with that, we need better, and we need better paid teachers. I'm not pandering there. I mean it. We need better, and we need better paid teachers. Just recently, the former CEO of IBM said, just so confused over this, bemused, I guess would be the word, said, I don't understand. I don't understand. The most important employee in the country is the teacher, because the teacher is the person who teaches all the other kids what they're going to be doing the rest of their lives. Why is this person so low on the pecking order? That has to stop. That has to stop. We also need to come up with vocational programs for kids who are not going to go on to college. Not everybody goes on to college, and trust me, as one who teaches in one, I can tell you that a lot of them don't belong there. But why do they go? I don't know. I had no place else to go. I don't know. They said I should show up here. I don't know. Why are you here? I'm not sure why I'm here. Okay, and I would say, and believe me, this is anecdotally, probably 25% of my students really don't belong there. It isn't necessarily that they're not smart enough. It's just not where they want to be. Where is it written that kids must go to college? No, they must do something in life that is meaningful. That's what they must do. And if they're not going to go to college, let us give them the opportunities to excel in other areas, whether it's something like plumbing, roofing, auto mechanics, solar panel technicians. You know, these are quality jobs that can't be outsourced. When I was a kid, my parents talked about things like plumbers, electricians, and stuff like that disparagingly. In fact, you know, You want to go to college so you don't wind up being a plumber. I'd like to make what they make, okay? And more than that, those jobs aren't going to be outsourced to India. Not going to happen. There are no lines that long, okay? So we need to do these things. We need to make this honorable instead of having people feel that they've become second-class citizens. Any job is honorable as long as that job is contributing to the well-being of society. That's what honorable is all about. And finally, when we talk about changes in the infrastructure, we need to make school districts more efficient. I am on the warpath on this one. We have 1,000 school districts in this state. That means 1,000 superintendents in this state. That means many thousands of associate superintendents, and on and on and on and on. We have such duplication. The biggest waste we have in government is at the local level. Not only school districts, that's what we're talking about today, police districts, fire districts, the whole thing again and again and again, one little town next to another, each having its own. We can't afford it. In the old days, when people went from one town to another, galloping along on a horse, okay, fine. 10 miles away took you the day to get there. Now 10 miles is 10 minutes unless you get a speeding ticket. No, it's not that way anymore. You know, we're all together. It's a much more dense society, and because of that, we need to change our mindset. You know, I live in this little town, Los Gatos, and it's a nice little idyllic town, and it has a high school district, Los Gatos Saratoga High School District. Okay, and so recently, a couple of years ago, the folks from Campbell, that's next door, all of about a stone's throw away, came to my school district, and they said, "Hey, you've got a superintendent. We've got a superintendent. You've got an associate or two. We've got a couple of associates. You know, we've got all these duplicative functions. What if we merge? Think of all the money we could save and put to work in hiring more teachers, paying teachers more money. This isn't even taking more money from the public. This is simply doing a little bit of merging and consolidating." And my board of trustees thought about it for about 10 seconds. You know, voted no, and then asked the sergeant at arms to escort those folks out. How dare you? How dare we in Los Gatos merge with those Campbellians? We don't even know if they've had their shots. I mean, this is crazy. This is, when you think of all of the money we are wasting from these duplicative services. Santa Clara County, where I live, you know, there are like 32 school districts. There are like, 19 fire departments and 16 police departments in this one urban county. It does not make sense. Multiply that times all the other 57 counties and all the other multiple duplicative districts, and you get the point. We need, finally, to train people to succeed. The days of manufacturing and assembly in this country are over because almost any other country can do it for less and do it better. Okay? We need, however, to return to the #1 status that we used to have until very recently. #1 in research, #1 in development, #1 in innovation. These are the things that have always made this country great. We can't be these things unless we teach these things. And it isn't just a matter of teaching them science. It's a matter of teaching our kids how to think. That means pouring billions of dollars into our education system and workforce development. So I would simply conclude by offering these couple of observations. It's one thing to become a great nation. It's another thing to remain a great nation. When you become that great nation, everybody else is going to be there to try to do what you do. And unless you keep doing it better, they will catch up and they will surpass you. And then we'll be looking at other great nations. The idea of the automatic pilot doesn't work. And in an ever competitive world, no one gets a free ride. We've got to act. We've got to act now on all fronts. It starts with you and me. It starts with us in the classroom. But it's not only educating our kids. It's educating our parents. It's educating our elected officials. It's banging on doors. It's making them hear. It's getting them to do the right thing. We've got to send our kids out with that message. We've got to carry that message ourselves, because that's the only way that this society will become as great as it should be and stay as great as it should be. And you today are here to help that happen. And I thank you for coming here, and I thank you for letting me take a few minutes of your time to talk about it.
As I think you know, if you've read the biography that we included in the packet, Deborah Bowen was the 6th woman in California history to have been elected to a statewide constitutional office. She's an attorney. She's a longtime state legislator. And let me just say, from an educator's perspective, she's been a particularly strong advocate in the position of Secretary of State to advance education on voting. I assume that she's going to be saying quite a bit about that, but let me just add that the My Vote California and all the efforts that she has, all the time that she's invested in this and the efforts that have come from that investment of time, we hope will pay off when these kids are older and registered to vote. And so that, unlike in the California Civic Health Index that we distributed, we won't be in the bottom half of the states in the United States. We'll push to the top. So without any further ado, Deborah Bowen.
Oh, and that, young people from Elk Grove, kudos to you. That was awesome. That was absolutely great. And I'm looking forward to meeting with you a little bit afterwards, before I take off, and we'll have a little bit of chance to chat. You actually reminded me of my learning a little bit about democracy and civics. I organized my first protest in 7th grade. Okay, so teachers and administrators, you can close your ears now. It was over censorship of the school newspaper. And I organized a sit-in in the hall. And in those days, girls could not wear pants. You had to wear skirts. And if you knelt, the skirt had to be 3 inches from the floor, which of course meant that we just rolled them up after we got them measured. But anyway, that prompted a call to my parents, and but I was not in trouble for that because I was standing up for something that I thought was really important. It was a principle that we had talked about at home. And the second protest came in 9th grade, and it was over the issue of dress code, and specifically that girls could not wear pants to school. So I organized a pants-wearing day for girls. I was in 9th grade, and we didn't wear jeans or scruffy pants. We all wore our very best trousers. And I got kicked out of my geometry class, got a 0 on the test, got a B+ instead of an A in the class because of that. And once again, my parents were called. Once again, I was not in trouble. So what I learned at home is that it is not wrong to stand up for what is right. And I think part of what you are learning is how to stand up for what is right. Now, you don't always get what you want. And sometimes it just takes a long time for you to get it. And I certainly learned that as a legislator. Sometimes you never get it. I remember for a long time ago trying to carry a bill to urge that food be labeled if it had trans fat in it. And this is something that's really harmful to the heart. And I couldn't get that bill out of the first committee, which was the Agriculture Committee. And, of course, now in California we've prohibited trans fat in lots of things, and marketers or boxes say no trans fat on foods that never had any to start with. But one of the things as the chief elections official that's important to me is teaching democracy. There are really 3 things about elections that are critical, and things that I pledged to do in my campaign to be Secretary of State 4 years ago. One was to get every eligible voter registered to vote, which is, that's an impossible goal, but still we have to have the goal. It's like having every student have a 4-point average, right? The second is to have a convenient way for every eligible voter to cast his or her ballot. And the third is to count every single ballot the way it was cast. And the goals are so simple, and the doing them is so hard. But we don't get people eligible to vote and voting unless they understand democracy and what's at stake. And the young people who are here today clearly understand that. But it is not instinctive. It's not wired. You know, it's not like watching my cats and my dogs who just instinctively know a lot about how to operate in the world. Democracy is new in the history of human beings, very new, and our democracy is just a tiny little baby in the history of how people organize themselves. It's still in diapers, and we are learning better ways to pass the torch. And we have a lot to learn, actually, by how this is done in other countries, not just in other states, and by how the United States government has helped in countries that don't have a history of democracy. A little frustrating for me, I have to say. I had the opportunity to go to Bosnia, which was a communist country until not all that long ago, no history of democracy, and there is a curriculum teaching individual rights and democracy that starts in kindergarten. And I had an opportunity to see some of it. And my frustration is that a lot of it is funded by the United States government. But we don't do the same kind of work in our own country. So the kids were learning in fourth grade the limits of leadership and authority. They were learning things like if we elect Mr. Orange to be our president and he decides that everybody should wear orange T-shirts to honor him, is that okay? Well, no. You know, just because you're elected president doesn't mean you get to order everybody to wear orange T-shirts. That was actually a part of the curriculum in Bosnia. So very interesting to see how differently this is addressed throughout the world. And, of course, I grew up in a household where it would have been unthinkable not to vote. You just didn't vote. My mother and my grandmother used to get in arguments over the phone that inevitably ended up with someone hanging up on someone else. My grandmother would say, "Look what they're doing again," and my mother would say, "We are the they." Who's the they, Mom? It's us voting. And I have no idea what the subject matter was. But there are a lot of households where students don't learn that, where that is not a tradition. And there are a lot of countries where we have strong immigration patterns where voting and democracy is not a part of the culture from where people come from. And even if there is voting, that doesn't necessarily mean there's democracy. There are plenty of places where people vote, and one of my favorite stories comes from a country in the Eastern Bloc where the results that were being reported from the precincts, the margin that was added to favor the leader was so great that in some precincts they ended up with more votes for the leader than there were registered voters in that precinct. And the country really needed an honest election so that they could go to the World Bank and borrow money. And when they got, you know, a 95% positive result, no one took it seriously, because that's not usually how it works in a real democracy where there's a real exchange of ideas and where people don't always have the same idea. And we certainly don't in this country right now. And we are at a very interesting time. So the teachers who are working, doing this, and trying to figure out how to fit this into all of the other things that go into the curriculum requirements, how to make sure that this is done in a way that doesn't disrupt the time, that generates the test scores that are so important and unfortunately getting more important as we go along in some respects. I really want to hand it to the teachers who are here and the teachers who make this an important part of what they do. I think we're due for a total overhaul of how we teach civics. The book version of it and the chart with the 3 branches of government and the bill becoming law is deadly. I remember my foster daughter, when she first looked at that chart, how a bill becomes law, she'd been up here with me several times. She said, "Where are the lobbyists?" And one of my staff cracked, "Oh, that's the white space." And another time she said to me, "You know, they seep in everywhere, don't they?" We're at some kind of event. So there's a big difference between learning what it looks like on a piece of paper and how it actually works. And the students who did the Library Tech project have learned a lot about how it actually works and how the people who are involved in it, because it's all run by people, how the people have so much of an impact and why it is so important to have the checks and balances that our founding fathers, I think, so wisely wrote into our government. It's really amazing when you look back and think, you know, part of it came from mistrust. They came from a situation in which power was so abused that they really didn't want to just turn over power. You know, if King George were still here, nobody would be giving you a free hand to put whatever you want on your iPod, that's for sure. You know, it was, everything belonged to the king. So people could just come in, soldiers could come in, stay in your bed, take your iPod, raid your fridge, take your clothes. None of it belonged to you anyway. Legally, it all belonged to King George. So what our founders did really was revolutionary. It was treason. And they were extraordinarily courageous. And they did something really profound. Now, they also set up a mechanism that we could improve it as we went along. And, of course, one of the things that they did was they set it up so that in most states you had to be white, male, and own 50 acres in order to have a voice. And I see some white men around here, but I doubt that many of them own 50 acres. So in all likelihood, there's nobody in this room who would have been allowed to vote at the beginning of the country. And we have had pretty major battles over creating that kind of equality. And that's part of what you do in a democracy, too. And we have a system that allows us to assess how it's working and to propose not only changes about, you know, what do you have to pass a high school exit exam, but about how the system itself works. And we've done that a number of times. And, you know, it's women actually have only had the vote for 90 years, so it's pretty recent. The first woman was elected to the United States Congress before she was eligible to vote. Think about that. So this way of learning by doing for our students, I think, is really critical. I'm really looking forward to working with Tom Torlakson as our next superintendent of public education. I had the pleasure of serving with him in the state senate. It's great to work with somebody who's been a teacher, a classroom teacher, because he understands what it is like to stand in front of the classroom every day and to deal with all the things that happen in students' lives besides just school. But this really is, this foundation and this work that the teachers who are here are doing, because this is Civics Day for teachers, and it was great to have the kids here, but I've been talking to them, but you know, you teachers know that I'm talking to them in the same kind of way that you do. You have your own version of it. I wish I could be a fly on the wall, and you know, in one civics class a day, I would learn a lot about how to do this. But it really is my honor to join you and to be a part of this endeavor, not just to ensure the integrity of the electoral process, and that's what led me to undertake a top-to-bottom review of voting systems, and it's why in California very few people vote on an electronic voting machine, because we could not assure that the system couldn't be tampered with. And we couldn't assure, many people ask me about internet voting, but we have seen, actually there was an internet voting pilot project undertaken by the District of Columbia just this year, and they made a commitment to transparency. They put the system and the code up on the internet, and within 1 week, some of the University of Michigan students who had been involved in the top-to-bottom review in California, that's how they got their founding, they were able to break into the system, and they left a little calling card. They wrote in a little program so that when the voter finished voting, it played, the system played the University of Michigan fight song. the internet was not designed to be secure. And we bank on it because banks have a commitment to fix their errors. But if the error rate in the banking system at ATMs or over the internet is 1%, and you can fix that with money, that's one thing. What would a 1% error rate look like in a close election for, let's say, a race like Attorney General, where we just elected in California the 7th woman to statewide constitutional office and the first African American ever elected Attorney General? 1% would be the difference between swearing in the right person and swearing in the wrong person. So voting is different than everything else because we have zero tolerance for error and because we have to know who you are until the moment you walk up to vote, and from that moment on we cannot know a single thing about how you voted. So your grandmother can't know how you voted, your employer can't know. If you're in the military, your commanding officer can't know. These are things that are really important for us to actually get the true sense of what it is that is the will of the people. So my most frustrating thing is that a lot of people don't understand how much power they really have. And they also don't understand that if you don't vote, that politicians are going to ignore you because you don't vote, so you can't elect them or not. So if a certain group doesn't vote, they're likely to get less attention. But you have to get out there and vote before you change that, and it's a real chicken and egg problem. We are going to change that in California, starting with 4th grade, when we are first formally teaching students civics and California governance and going on through. We're going to start it well before that. You start it every day as classroom teachers when you teach your students how to solve disputes in the classroom. Because what we're after is teaching ways to solve disputes that don't involve violence in all of its forms. And democracy really is nothing but a trade-off of bullets for ballots, ballots for bullets, the other way around. We agree not to take up arms because we trust that the system of voting will express our views. And we know that if we lose, we get another shot at it in 2 years or 4 years. But that means we have to be absolutely certain that the process was fair and that we got the results right. And I don't endorse or participate in any elections in California. Of course, I did before I became Secretary of State. And I have a record, but it's important for people to be able to look at that and then look at my actions and say, that's fair. And it's important for the Secretary of State just to be the chief elections officer there for voters and for educating for democracy. You all learn that in 4th grade when you elect a class president. The 2 contestants or the 5 contestants are not the ones who count the ballots. So I'm the one who's counting the ballots, and that means I don't participate. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I know this is going to be the first of a great tradition of civics education days, and there's just so much to learn from each other about how we do things, and so many changes in the works nationally on getting people registered to vote in a way that doesn't depend on whether they happen to wander by somebody with a clipboard and a stack of forms on their way into the grocery store, which is a really dumb way to get people registered to vote if you stop and think about it. We can do better than that, and I think we will in the next 5 to 10 years make some big changes. And then we're going to turn it over to the young people who are in 6th grade today. Actually, it looks like we're turning it over to them already, at least part of it. So I'm happy to take questions if we have time. If the program doesn't allow, that's fine too. For you all can find me on Facebook and on Twitter. I cannot accept any more friends on Facebook. There's a limit. And so I have a waiting list. If you're a student and you want to be my Facebook friend, let me know, because students get first priority. When somebody drops off Facebook or gets sick of it and I have an opening, I always put a student in first, because it's my way to stay connected. We can actually have a real conversation that way, in a way that I wouldn't be able to do in a state with 37 million people in any other way. So that all is going to change everything too. And I don't know what's going to be next after Facebook and Twitter. It's going to be something else. And it's going to change democracy and the way we get information. It already has. And it's going to give your parents and your teachers a fit when you know as students way more than they do about a particular issue because you looked it up on the internet. Not that that's always right, and that's one of the challenges that we have as teachers and educators is to teach people how to learn what's right and what's not. So enjoy your day. Again, I'm so honored, so pleased to be here, and it was so great to hear the Elk Grove 6th graders. I really hope you get your library tech.
Thank you so much, Secretary Bowen. And I have to say, as a point of clarification, the Foundations of Democracy program and the Project Citizen program that Ms. Bowen witnessed in Bosnia actually was from the Center for Civic Education. We were the ones who helped them. In fact, we gave those curricula to the Bosnians and helped them adapt them to Bosnian circumstances. And it's been incredibly enriching in the years since 1996 for us to have that kind of relationship. I wish I could have been in your place to see that. One of these years, maybe I will. But thank you very much for coming. Now it's my great pleasure, moving right along, to introduce Professor Alan Brownstein. Professor Brownstein is a professor of law at the University of California, Davis. And he told me on the phone yesterday that he isn't a great fan of long-winded introductions, so I'll allow you to read the excellent 2 paragraphs that are in the biography. I do want to say, though, that it's an extraordinary thing for us to have a scholar of such eminence on the First Amendment, and as you've probably already read, his interest in church-state relations and free exercise and establishment clauses is profound. So without further ado, Professor Brownstein.
Well, it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here today. I'm a teacher. I teach at a law school, and I've never had any doubts that if university professors were half as good teachers as elementary school and junior high school and high school teachers, we'd have a much more effective university system than we have today. So my hat's off to you. You do a much better job in the classroom than most of us do, although we try. I was asked to speak about freedom of speech and elections. And few free speech disputes raise as many complex issues and implicate as many competing constitutional values as the intersection of freedom of speech and the regulation of the electoral process. Yet, as the Supreme Court's recent decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission demonstrates, the Court's decisions in this area of law may have critically important consequences for the operation of our democracy. The clash of interests here is stark and unavoidable. While freedom of speech serves both instrumental and dignitary values in our society, it's generally recognized that the instrumental role of free speech in an effectively functioning democracy is of paramount importance. Freedom of speech is crucial for democracy to function. And what this means is that, as a general matter, speech about government officials, speech about public policy issues, about electoral candidates, should be free from government interference and regulation. In the United States, we the people are vested with sovereign power. If our authority to hold government accountable for its actions is to be exercised in any meaningful way, we have to be able to debate the issues of the day on our own as independent private citizens and associations. Accordingly, under our constitutional system, private political discourse is typically none of the government's business, and it is beyond the government's regulatory power. For obvious reasons, we don't trust government to intrude into political debate. Government is far too biased by its own self-interest to act as an arbiter of what private citizens can say about the government itself. To turn a well-known phrase, If government is going to be of the people, and by the people, and for the people, government has to be kept separate from the people when we discuss political issues and exercise political power. But, and this is a really important but, our constitutional system isn't only designed to prevent the government from exercising undue power over the people. It also operates to prevent unrepresentative factions of the people from obtaining control of the government. The government seeks to diffuse potential centers of power and to balance them against each other. And government has a very necessary role to play in maintaining the effective operation of our democratic system through the conducting of elections, of doing what Secretary Bowen does every day on her job. Put simply, it is the business of government to run elections. This is a public responsibility. And regulating the operation of elections and ensuring that they operate fairly inevitably and intrinsically involves the government in the regulation of expressive activities. Thus, there's this unavoidable tension between the constitutional principle prohibiting government from regulating political speech and the necessary role that government has to play in conducting democratic elections. And this tension has often led to constitutional disputes adjudicated in federal court. Let me give you a few examples, and then I'll get to the major focus of my talk, which is the Citizens United case. Now, as some of you may know, streets and parks are called traditional public forums. These are locations where freedom of speech and assembly receives maximum protection. Yet in order to minimize the risk of fraud and coercion during elections, virtually every state has a law prohibiting electioneering, that is, political speech about the candidates running for office, within a buffer zone around polling places. California has such a law. Now, these no electioneering zones often extend out to public sidewalks near the polls. And so we have these content discriminatory regulations of political speech in traditional public forums that are designed to protect the integrity of the election system. Do those laws comply with the First Amendment? Well, in Burson versus Freeman in 1992, the Supreme Court upheld these regulations under strict scrutiny review. Just last year, in a case called Doe versus Reed, the court rejected a facial First Amendment challenge to a state public records law that permitted members of the public to obtain the names of registered voters who had signed a referendum petition. The referendum in question sought to repeal a state law expanding the rights of same-sex domestic partners. Plaintiffs in the case, pointing to the experience of supporters of Proposition 8 in California, argued that the disclosure of their identities would chill the willingness of voters to sign controversial referendum petitions in the future. The Supreme Court agreed with the plaintiffs that signing a referendum petition is an expressive act entitled to First Amendment protection. Moreover, previous court decisions had held that freedom of speech includes the right to write and to distribute political literature anonymously, without anyone knowing who you are. But the court upheld the public records law against this facial challenge. Disclosure laws may burden speech to some extent, it said, but they don't prevent or ban expression entirely. And the burdens on speech resulting from this law were outweighed by the state's interest in combating fraud, identifying invalid signatures, and promoting transparency and accountability in the electoral process. Finally, in a case called Arkansas Educational Television Commission versus Forbes, 1998 case, the court upheld the decision of a state-owned public television station to limit participation in a congressional candidate's debate to only major party candidates and those candidates with strong popular support. Now, this case didn't technically involve the regulation of elections, but it clearly involved a state policy that impacted the ability of minor candidates to reach the electorate with their message. Still, the court upheld the decision to bar minor candidates from participating in this televised debate. But the most important case dealing with freedom of speech and the regulation of the electoral process was the Supreme Court's recent decision in Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission. In Citizens United, the court reviewed the constitutionality of two campaign finance regulations. The first regulation said that corporations and unions were prohibited from using general Treasury funds to make independent expenditures that expressly advocated the election or defeat of a candidate in a federal election. Second regulation said that corporations and unions are prohibited from engaging in electioneering communications, that is, publicly distributed broadcast, cable, or satellite communications referring to a clearly identified candidate for federal office within 30 days of a primary election or 60 days of a general election. As you all know, the Supreme Court struck down both regulations on the grounds that they violated the First Amendment's free speech clause. Now, to reach this result, the court had to resolve several important issues. Most of these issues, in my judgment, are far more difficult and far more controversial than the court suggested in its majority opinion. The first question is whether corporations are persons with the same fundamental rights as living human beings, you and me. More specifically, do free speech rights in the electoral process extend to corporate entities? I think this is a much harder question to answer than the court did. Corporations are, of course, artificial entities. Their legal form is created and given its various powers and immunities by government. People are different. Government doesn't create and form the people. The people create and form the government. It's jarring to our ears to imagine our founding documents declaring as self-evident truths that all men and corporations are created equal, or that all men and corporations are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. From that perspective, one might argue that corporations have no constitutional rights at all. But we know that that argument proves too much. Corporations clearly have some rights. The government can't take a corporation's property without paying it just compensation. The government can't raid, search, and seize evidence from corporate offices without complying with the Fourth Amendment. So the question isn't whether corporations have any constitutional rights at all. They clearly have some rights. It's whether they have the right to use their resources to communicate messages intended to directly influence federal elections. Now, in the context of elections, one might still argue that corporations have to be distinct from human persons. Corporations, after all, have no right to vote. They have no right to hold office. Accordingly, as artificial creations, they shouldn't have a constitutional right to engage in electoral politics either. This was the position of former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, a very staunch conservative, who, of course, was replaced by the new Chief Justice John Roberts about 5 years ago. But the court in Citizens United pays little attention to the argument that corporate speech intended to influence elections is less protected and more vulnerable to election regulations than speech by human beings, by human persons. To the court, speech is speech, whether it's funded by a corporate treasury or expressed by a person standing on a soapbox or distributing a pamphlet that endorses a candidate. And as long as the speech isn't formally coordinated with a candidate's campaign, it's political speech that receives maximum First Amendment protection. Well, if these campaign finance provisions are to be treated as generic speech regulations rather than electoral regulations restricting speech, then the next question the court must confront is the nature of the regulation. Under accepted free speech doctrine, courts distinguish between viewpoint and content discriminatory speech regulations, and those receive very rigorous review, and content-neutral regulations, which are evaluated under a less exacting standard of review. And here one might argue that the message communicated by corporations, that is, the substance of what the corporations say, is not the subject of these campaign finance regulations. The regulations are directed at the corporate form of the entity that expresses the message. They're directed at the source of the revenue that subsidizes the message, corporate treasuries. They're not directed at the content of what the message says. And as such, these campaign finance provisions might be characterized as content-neutral regulations of speech, and then they'd be evaluated under a less demanding standard of review. The court rejected that argument in Citizens United. It insisted that these campaign finance laws are directed at who may speak, not the manner in which they speak. A law distinguishing among speakers, the court said, is no different than a law that discriminates against the subject or viewpoint of the speaker's message. Accordingly, these laws must be strictly scrutinized to determine if they comply with the requirements of the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment. Now, under strict scrutiny review, a law must be necessary to the furtherance of a compelling state interest. And the Supreme Court discussed several interests that might justify the challenged campaign finance regulations before it. The court concluded that all of the interests were insufficiently important to justify such a heavy burden on speech. One argument involved an anti-distortion interest. The concern here was that the special privileges that corporations receive, such as limited liability, perpetual life, and other favorable treatment facilitating the accumulation and distribution of assets, and the resulting wealth that corporations have obtained because of those privileges, that provides corporations an unfair advantage in the political marketplace, providing them undue influence in elections. Now, the government didn't stress this anti-distortion argument in defending the challenged laws, and the Supreme Court rejected the argument out of hand, grounding its analysis on a key conclusion stated in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, which was a really seminal campaign finance regulation case decided in 1976. The court held that the government has no legitimate interest in equalizing the relative ability of individuals and groups to influence the outcome of elections. Now, again, in my judgment, the government's failure to press this issue and the court's refusal to take it seriously was regrettable. A significant majority of the Congress, and I suspect an even larger majority of the American people, recognizes the distorting effect of wealth on the fairness of American regulations. And this is particularly true when the wealth in question is dependent on the special legal privileges provided to corporations and unions. I think this concern deserved a more serious discussion than it received in the majority opinion in the Citizens United case. Now, let me be absolutely clear here that I am not suggesting that this is an easy constitutional question to resolve. The court's reluctance to uphold any governmental regulations restricting political speech has considerable persuasive force behind it. But there is another side to this argument. The challenge campaign finance regulations, after all, didn't attempt to equalize political power and expressive opportunities across the board. The government was trying to use law to limit the political advantages of wealth amassed through economic privileges that had been created by law. The court's response that the state cannot exact as the price of these special corporate advantages the forfeiture of First Amendment rights wasn't entirely convincing to me. No one was being asked to surrender their rights as individuals in order to obtain legal benefits. The individuals who form or purchase stock in a corporation can still use all of their private resources, not obtained from the corporation itself, to influence elections. Moreover, state-created corporate privileges play an important role in providing the advantages that corporations utilize in maximizing their resources to influence the electoral process. By way of comparison, when government gives financial subsidies and tax benefits to nonprofit associations such as charities, it's commonplace to prohibit those recipients of government largesse from using those government benefits for political purposes. Charities can't lobby. So we can ask, are financial subsidies and tax benefits so different from regulatory privileges that a more limited constraint on speech can't be imposed on businesses that are permitted to take on a corporate structure? Is it so clearly unconstitutional to give corporations a legal structure through which they can achieve substantial economic benefits, but to offer those advantages with the understanding that they can only be used for economic purposes and not political purposes? 5 justices on the United States Supreme Court are convinced that doing so is unconstitutional. I'm less certain. Now, the primary interest the government asserted in Citizens United to justify its campaign finance regulations was the purpose of preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption by elected officials. And here the court agreed that preventing a quid pro quo exchange of political favors for campaign contributions was a compelling state interest. That would be a sufficient goal to justify restrictions on direct contributions to a candidate's campaign. Preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption, however, was not an adequate justification for prohibiting independent corporate expenditures intended to influence an election. Because these expenditures were not prearranged or coordinated with a candidate's official campaign, the court didn't believe that they created a significant danger of quid pro quo commitments between contributor and electoral candidate. Now, the court recognized, of course, that corporate contributors committing substantial independent expenditures to a candidate's election will expect something in return. They'll expect favorable treatment for the policies that they support. But the court explained that the award of this kind of generic influence and access to those who support a candidate's election is intrinsic to politics in a democracy. Voters and contributors support a candidate who supports the policies that they favor. And the candidate in turn responds by endorsing the policies of their supporters. That's not corruption. That's how democracy works, the court explained. Now, the court is clearly correct that the essence of democracy is a responsive relationship between elected officials and the people that they represent. What's troubling about the court's analysis in this case is its apparent inability to distinguish between people and dollars. It doesn't distinguish between corporations and people, and it can't distinguish between people and money. When officials afford special access and influence to corporations and unions in return for a disproportionately large independent expenditure for the election of a candidate? Is that really just an example of responsive representative democracy at work? Or, as many Americans believe, is there a serious risk here that the responsive relationship between the elected officials and corporate and union sources of massive electoral contributions will trump, undermine, and drown out the responsive relationship between the elected officials and the voters at large, the responsive relationship between elected officials and you and me? Thank you.